Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Leslie Thompson. I'm Director of Adult Programs at the Sid Richardson Museum. And I want to thank you for joining us for our lecture this evening. Before I introduce our program and our guest speaker, I want to first acknowledge and recognize the original inhabitants of the land that we're on with a land acknowledgement. So we, the Sid Richardson Museum, respectfully acknowledge all Native American peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial. And the Sid would like to especially acknowledge and pay respect to the Wichita and affiliated tribes, which include the Waco, Kachai, Tawakoni, and Tauvea, upon whose historical homeland our museum is located. Now, tonight's topic might be familiar to some of our audience, but I imagine for many of us, myself included, there are going to be some new bits of history to discover. Something new that I've learned since working at the SID, for example, is that many of the terms or vocabulary, the tools, the equipment, the clothing that we associate with the American cowboy actually originated from the Mexican vaquero. And those roots go even much deeper, so as we'll learn tonight. So I just continue to learn just how global the history of the cowboy is. Now, before we get into the program, I want to do a little bit of Zoom housekeeping to bring your attention to a couple things. I mentioned in my my reminder email this week that we can't see y'all. You can only see me and our guest speaker, but we still want to hear from you. So that's why I want to bring to your attention a couple of things on Zoom. The first of which is the chat box. And this is, of course, where you can leave a comment or engage in conversation. And I'll actually, again, help you to test out the chat box feature by asking everyone, if you are watching this at home with other people with you, if you have a +1 or more with you, if you would go ahead and type that number into the chat box of how many people are at home there watching with you, that would actually help us keep more accurate attendance numbers. Because like I said, I can't see you, so I don't know how many people are behind each device logging in. So I'd really appreciate that. So thank you. So that's the chat box. And then of course, the other feature I want to point out to you is the Q&A box. And this is where I'm going to ask you to put your questions. You'll find the Q&A box somewhere on your control panel for Zoom. So I'm going to ask you, leave your comments in the chat box, but if you have a question, leave it in the Q&A box so that we can collect them all in one spot, so I don't miss any as we get to the Q&A section of the presentation at the end. So I think that covers our housekeeping. I'm very excited to bring you tonight's program titled Caballeros y Vaqueros. You know, when we think of famous cowboys, they often conjure up Hollywood images of John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, or maybe Roy Rogers. But in reality, the iconic Western cowboy can actually trace its roots to North and West Africa and up through Spain and then over into the New World. And a couple years ago in 2019, the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, which is up in Oklahoma City, they organized an exhibit called Caballeros y Vaqueros, which told this story using decorative traditions of New World husbandry as they developed in New Spain and colonial Mexico from a fusion of Native American, European, African, and Islamic traditions. And our guest speaker is going to be providing an overview of some of that story as well tonight. And so with that, I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Michael Grauer, who is an authority on the art, history, and culture of all aspects of the American West. Prior to joining the staff at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in 2018, where he is the McCasland Chair of Cowboy Culture and Curator of Cowboy Collections in Western Art, Michael was at the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon, Texas for 31 years, where he was Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs and Curator of Art and Western Heritage. Michael has taught courses on the histories, material cultures, and arts of the American West since 1994, and he has written several articles and books and curated over 100 exhibitions throughout his 30-plus year career. And we are delighted and honored to have Michael Grauer with us tonight to take us on a virtual journey through the origins of Western horse culture. So with that, I'm going to mute my mic and I will pass it over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, folks, for joining us this evening. It's always good to visit Fort Worth, albeit even by Zoom, and visit the great museum that's the Sid Richardson Museum. And when it reopens, y'all owe it to yourselves to go and visit there and see their great art treasures that help us better understand the American West. Thank you again for the generous introduction, Leslie, and kind of stole a little bit of my thunder about the exhibition, and I'll tell some more about that in just a minute. But I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that this is an important day in lots of different ways, not the least of which, of course, is the raising of the flag over the National World War I Memorial in Washington, D.C. That happened this morning. And I just like to thank all the veterans who are watching here for your service. It was a very moving event this morning. It's something that's a burgeoning interest in me over the last few years of my life. And one of my first exhibition here at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum was called Cowboys in Khaki. And it was about Westerners who served in the Great War. And so I wanted to acknowledge that here before we get started. As Leslie was saying, we did do an exhibition in 2019 that lasted over into the spring of 2020 called Caballeros y Vaqueros, Origins of Western Horse Cultures, and it was a guest curator. It was co-curated with our associate curator of history, Nathan Jones, as a companion to the Traditional Cowboy Artists Association that we host an exhibit of and sale of each fall. And so it was nice to be able to compare those two together, a historical context exhibition that used almost exclusively artifacts from our material culture collection here at the National Cowboy Museum, in conjunction with the continuing of those traditions with the artists who are working today. So it was a nice hand in glove exhibition. But my study of the evolution of the American cowboy has been going on virtually all my life. Ever since I could read, I started reading about cowboys and Indians in the American West. And so, it's just something that it continues to fascinate me. And I won't labor on that too long. I was talking to my mother a few minutes ago, and she wanted me to remind you that I was on the back of a horse at about 2 years old. So anyway, there it is. And my grandfather always had horses up in northeastern Kansas. And, that's my earliest memories are hanging over the corral fence, looking at the horses, even before anybody else was up. So, that's all I ever wanted to be was dreaming of being a cowboy, like Willie and Waylon sing about. So I get to study them every single day. So on the screen is a watercolor that we acquired here at the National Cowboy Museum a couple of years ago by a German artist who was working in Mexico and South America in the early 1830s. It's one of the earliest renderings of cowboys that you'll see from the 1830s. And of course, most of what we know in the imagery of those early people that we call cowboys today, in most cases, they're printed materials. We don't really find originals too often. So it's very fortunate that we have this, not only very fine painting, but also a great document of the history of cowboys. And you just notice a couple of things. Most importantly is they're using ropes. And that's the essence of cow work, is how good you were with a rope. It's a little bit difficult to see, but they're both wearing leather clothing. Those riders in the foreground, which means they are probably not peninsulares. In other words, they are not noble born. They're probably not criollos. They're probably either a native people, or they're biracial people, or they're African American. And in all three being enslaved people who did this work. The gist of this is that the very first cowboys were Indians. That flips everything on its ear. That old cliche about cowboys and Indians, it flips it completely when we understand the fact that, in fact, the very first cowboys, called vaqueros, workers on the back of a horse who work cows, they were native people. So just real quickly, the genesis of the exhibition is based on the permanent collections here at the National Cowboy Museum. And these are a couple of shots of the American Cowboy Gallery, which really deals with the industry in one part and the people who make up that industry. And the slide on the right is actually the sort of Spanish ranching roots of the gallery, and also the story here with a hacendado mannequin that you can see up there on that sort of stage, and then an exhibit on early ranching techniques there in the center, and on to the right an exhibit on charros, which we'll get to later on. On the left, what I call the Ortega Chapel are the works of Luis Ortega, one of the greatest artists who participated in a long-standing tradition in cowboydom, let's call it, braiding rawhide and horsehair, and we acquired his collection in the early 90s, and I think it's a great place for quiet reflection when we think about those craftsmen that went into, and those artists that went into making this part of the American dialogue ultimately, because remember, America isn't just the United States. It goes all the way down to the southern tip of South America. But the most important, and one of my favorite artifacts here in the collection, is this little sandal with a spur attached to it. And it reminds us that the very first cowboys were usually barefoot, or they were wearing a sandal, or a little later on, a low shoe. They weren't wearing boots. Boots come much, much later. And so what we have in the collection is this spur attached to a sandal to remind us that these people are peons. They are worker people. They are not the ricos that make the money. And in most cases, they were enslaved people. So this is the very first cowboy boot, let's call it. And it helps us better understand where this origin really starts. So the exhibition opened, as you can see, in September 2019, ran to January the following year. And we used all kinds of things from our collection. We really started with the roots of the domestication of the horse in Central Asia, probably in what's known as Afghanistan now. And we used placeholder objects like this pair of Afghani stirrups to talk about that story. Just a gateway, literally using material culture object as a gateway to tell a better story. And we also happen to have a fragment of a Tang Dynasty horse from the John Wayne collection, no less, to talk about the domestication of the horse and the movement of that transhumance of these different technologies around Asia up into China, and then eventually over to Northern Europe, and then into Southern Europe. So it was, again, these are ways to tell that story. And the whole idea of a person on horseback, an equestrian, of course, which raises that question, what in fact is the difference between a caballero and a vaquero? A caballero roughly is a gentleman on horseback. A vaquero is a man on horseback, usually male, a man on horseback who works cows. Literally a cow worker, a cow man. And so that noble person on the back of a horse finds its way in art history from the earliest times, and we see mounted figures quite early on, including this Marcus Aurelius. Now, the tradition amongst and riding, and I'm leaping forward a number of centuries here, the technique of riding evolved over time, where you went from riding bareback to riding with some sort of pad, an animal skin, or maybe a woven textile with no stirrups. And eventually the evolution of the stirrup is a one-toe thong developed in either China or India to help stabilize you on the back of the horse. And eventually that comes forward to where a riding style called a la brida. And that's really what the legs locked, and knees locked, and the legs permanently out. And this is really a military way of riding. And show you an example there, a Donatello sculpture of Guatemala, who was a great mercenary in the Renaissance times. You can see how he's riding with that leg firmly locked. And then, of course, this is about stability in the saddle and fighting in these battles, like you see in this great Uccello's Battle of San Romano. One had to have great stability and rode much, much bigger horses. The horses were much larger. War horses, often armored up themselves, and so putting that leg out was really the only way to stabilize yourself in battle. I'm fortunate for this talk, and also in my own research, that True West magazine actually asked the question, where is Cowboy Ground Zero in 2013, and it really aided my research and many others' research to look at that. And they provided a convenient map to talk about the arrival of the horse in North America, or in the Americas, in 1519, followed by cattle a few years later. But they show in their map at least a partial rendering of really where cowboy ground zero is. And you'll notice in North Africa, up into Spain, and then across the Atlantic, and then eventually to Mexico. And there's also a pathway from the British Isles, and that's really mainly an Atlantic coast phenomenon that does trickle down to a little bit of an extent. But the bringing of the bovine in 1521 really establishes that ranching technology and that ranching tradition in Mexico. And generally, the Spanish herding technique was completely open range, no castration of the bull calves. There was branding going on if you could catch them, but generally the cattle roamed as wild as they could be. And so we need to understand that context is let them go, try to manage them in some way or another. But those first people that managed it developed both north and south, down to the tip of South America, to where we have gauchos, another type of cowboy down there, and their technologies are similar, but there does develop both north and south different techniques. But it really starts with that landing of cattle and horses by 1521 in what's now Central America, and that's the key, as it goes from north and south. So what's brought from North Africa to Spain and then across the Atlantic is a new riding style called up in the air. And they learned this from Arab warriors, because of course the Moors conquered Spain in the 8th century, and lower Spain, southern Spain, what is called Andalusia today, is really an Arabic word, al-Andalus, the Arabic region. And eventually they were pushed out by 1492. But for 600 years, they brought their technologies and life ways to southern Spain. And one of those was riding up in the air, a more mobile way to move around in the saddle and do more work from the back of the horse rather than just fighting. And so, and oftentimes they would ride on the ball of the foot rather than on the instep, which is allows for much greater movement. And so you'll notice the knee is bent. And so with the Spanish herding techniques to allow those animals to run wild, roundups really didn't happen. The Spanish word, of course, is rodeo, the Spanish word for roundup. That didn't really happen. They were wild animals, and so they literally were cow hunts. So you went out and hunted them, as you can see here in this sort of melodramatic rending with dogs and swords, and it was really quite a thing. But you're still riding a la jineta, and that's the key. Now, amongst the first vaqueros by default were Presidio Soldiers. As the spread of Catholicism happened from that first landing in Mexico, first faith-based places and missions were there, and then usually a presidio very close by to protect the converts as well as the religious people. They brought food animals with them, cattle and sheep, and by default, oftentimes these Presidio soldiers had to learn how to be herders themselves, although oftentimes they were criollos, but at the same time they were herding people too, so they're part of this equation as well. We were fortunate at Panhandle Plains Historical Museum while I was there to have a really rare example of a North African saddle, as you can see here, with carved wooden stirrups. You can kind of see the size of this, and this is bringing not only that riding style, using a horse to herd animals, but also a different kind of tool in a high back saddle with a high horn, and it helped to eventually accommodate a technology that's introduced a little bit later. So during the 16th century, you can see these Spanish vaqueros used a lance, as you can see, a crescent-shaped blade, des jare tadera, best way I can pronounce it. It's a hawking blade. It cuts the hamstrings and it cripples the animal so that the hide can be peeled off and the carcass rendered for tallow, because the most valuable product on a beef cow or a beef steer was its hide and its tallow. And the tallow, of course, forms into a substance that was highly valued. So exactly what's happening in the 1500s, stripping the hide off, leaving the flesh to rot for the most part because there were just so many of them, would repeat itself 300 years later with the American bison. So it's all that about the abundance of a resource, often causes waste. And so that's exactly what was going on. You know, some of the beef was preserved, jerked, and dried out, carne seca, but for the most part, it was the hides and the tallow that were the primary product. So additional research in recent years provides a new cowboy ground zero, not only from the British Isles, you can see in this map that now hangs in our American Cowboy Gallery, not only from North Africa up into Spain, but from West Africa. And therefore, I often tell people that cowboy ground zero is ultimately Africa, because those West Africans, enslaved people, often Fulani, used a rope to manage their cattle herds, and they roped from foot. And we learned this from new research by Andrew Slider in a relatively recent publication that helps us better understand it's a much more complex and layered story. And even in the early 16th century, Creole slaves were performing in Spain, performing roping techniques, oftentimes extending a rope on a stick. But what I'm trying to convey to you is it's the combination of a technology of riding and herding an animal from the back of a horse from North Africa, combined with another technology using a rope from West Africa. And that's how we get what we know as the American cowboy today. So I juxtapose here that Presidio Soldier, which you can see is riding a saddle with a high cantle and a high horn. And the question is, did he use this? Was he always equipped with a rope? And what we have since learned is nearly always these Presidio Soldiers and these even Presidio Soldiers as well as Vaqueros nearly always became quite adept with a rope. So a dally, which of course comes from the Spanish phrase dar la vuelta, to wrap around, we call it dally today. And that was part of that management technique. People of color, which as I described earlier, cowboys of color, vaqueros of color, really, it was initially forbidden for them to ride a horse or a mule. But because of the need for a workforce, eventually they developed a system of licenses that were given to people of color to ride horses to manage these herds. In other words, the first cowboys needed a license to be on the back of a horse, and they carried it on their person. And if they if they didn't have it with them, they could be arrested and jailed in some way until they were returned to their owner. This same philosophy is transferred to the American South during the antebellum period. So anyone who was involved with training or riding horses or mules had to have a license on their person. So that's indeed a Spanish tradition. So the landing in the New World, of course, this is a relatively new map we use here now. In Spanish Mexico, as you can see, by 1521, about 200 years later, we see the establishment of Spanish Texas, mainly along the Gulf Coast, mainly in Bejar and Goliad, and then a little further east up in Nacogdoches. And now there, of course, there were already horseback cultures in French Louisiana that had been there as well, and also notice out to the west in Spanish California. So all of this moves. It starts in Texas, moves further to the north and to the east, and then to the west. So we have that establishment of these early cowboy communities. Spanish land grants in Texas were voluminous. And of course, Texas is joined with the state of Coahuila up until Texas independence in 1836. But it helps us understand the rangelands. They were enormous, especially in South Texas. As we look here at the Spanish land grants after it becomes its own republic, after Texas becomes its own republic, and then becomes a member of the United States in 1845. So those Spanish and Mexican land grants deferred from the English system in that everyone had the same opportunity for water. So if you look closely at these demarcations, they look kind of long and skinny. That's because everyone got a little bit of the riverfront. So I don't know if you can see this with my pointer. This is the Rio Grande here. Each one of these land grants had access to water. So, and that is actually transferred to most Texas water use today. So it's yet another philosophy that's transferred into Texas today. So same sort of thing out in Spanish and Mexican land grants in California, especially in Lower California. So we see that establishment going on. So it helps give a framework for how these people operated. This is a wonderful painting here in our collection by Jose Cisneros, who was not only a great artist, but a scholar in El Paso, Texas, who made it his life's work to study the evolution of these horseback people, these hombres a caballo. And so in this depiction, you can see this is a rather fancily dressed man. And this there becomes a separation. And you'll notice he uses the word caballero, because caballero is a gentleman. This is a person who owns the ranches but doesn't work the ranches. This is a person who invests and recoups the profits for the most part, but he doesn't actually work the cattle yet. He still wears the trappings, certainly ramped up, of that vaquero. And so therefore we explore that separation between a worker of cows and horses and someone who profits from the working of those cows and horses. So that's key. In our collection here, we've also acquired fairly recently an example of one of these Caballero saddles, which are really quite rare. You'll notice that it's covered with it's a saddle tree that's been covered with a mochila, which is a separate piece that slides over the cantle and over the horn. It's also highly embroidered, as you can see, in calfskin, and then worked silver on the horn here with a star in the middle of the horn cap. So these are what we see as the original ancestor of these highly decorated silver saddles that are ridden in parades, especially by Roy Rogers and Gene Autry in later years. The cession of lands after Texas independence in 1836, and then the Mexican-American War in 1846, really cut Mexican territory, because Mexico, of course, achieves its independence from Spain by 1821. It really creates the entire American Southwest. Texas claimed parts of New Mexico all the way up into Colorado and Wyoming when it seceded from Mexico. And then the other states, the western half of New Mexico, west of the Rio Grande, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California came in later. And then the little dark space down here, the Gadsden Purchase, down here at the bottom, comes in 1853. So all of this becomes part of the story. However, what we haven't talked about yet are the native people that were there, who first Spaniards, then Mexicans, and of course, U.S. citizens, French, English, were always trying to make some sort of treaty with. And new research on Comanches really puts out a pretty bold thesis that anything in the middle of the United States, east of the Rocky Mountains, all the way to the Mississippi River Valley, were controlled by the Comanches, either through fear and intimidation, and especially through trade. And they were absolutely unpredictable. No one really knew what they were going to do. And so it was a great ruling by fear. And there are scholars who literally call it the Comanche Empire, right smack in the middle of the United States. And it's really worth reading. Empire of the Summer Moon is a good source for this, but I would highly recommend another book by Pekka Hämäläinen called Comanche Empire. It's really a fascinating study of this particular people. But they were introduced to horse culture because of the Entrada by Coronado. And I wanted to show Frederick Remington, given the legacy there for Frederick Remington, not only here at the National Cowboy Museum, but especially there at the Sid Richardson Museum. But we also know that Frederick Remington destroyed a large number of works late in his career, including this painting. And we only know it because it was reproduced in color in Collier's magazine as part of a set of prints. It shows Coronado's Entrada up into the Southwest, up through New Mexico, up through across the Texas Panhandle, the Oklahoma Panhandle, up into Kansas. Another branch went west. But what's not shown here is we see all the people. What we don't see are the stock animals, because they drove the animals that they ate with them. So cattle and sheep were part of the Entrada, and many of those got away. The horses got away, and eventually they were adapted to Comanche life. An early set of lithographs by Luis Sanchez y Tapia during a fact-finding mission across the holdings for Mexico not long after their independence. But the horse is already very much part of their lifestyle, and you can see they're already using horn saddles. Could not have come from any other source than from those original North African technologies through Spain to Mexico, and then on up into the plains. Comanches became recognized as great horsemen And I'm often asked this question: who do I consider the greatest horseman? I would say either the Comanches or the Moors, because no one could ride horses like them, not even close. And so they adapted that very quickly into their lifestyle. Down in Texas, we did have artists like Richard Patry in the 1850s, who's also acknowledging that Comanche lifestyle and how it was so vital to their lifestyle to own horses and to be masters of those horses. They were also even managing bison herds, believe it or not, because it was a product they could use for trade. Unfortunately, their horse herds got so immense, they began to compete with bison for the grass on the southern plains. So that became something of an ecological problem. So the cession of lands by Mexico to the U.S. had a bit of a problem in that a good portion of that was Comancheria. And of course, the Comanches weren't consulted in any respect. So we need to keep that in mind, that right smack in the middle of this cession of lands is Comancheria, which had shrunk by the 1850s through various reasons, but it is important to keep in mind. So by 1867, with the beginning of the famous cattle drives, Comancheria, Comanches are asked to give up their free roaming ways on the back of a horse where they'd mastered the Mustang, and to give all that up, that middle part of the United States, and settle onto a corner of southwestern Oklahoma. So this is what they were willing to give up, or asked to give up at the Medicine Lodge Treaty in Kansas in 1867, and to settle here. So that horse culture is very much part of this equation too. Incidentally, during the early 1860s, through a series of invasions by British, Spanish, and French troops in Mexico, Maximilian of Habsburg is installed as the new Emperor of Mexico. He's the younger brother of the Emperor of Austria at this time. And he's installed in 1862 as the new Emperor of Mexico. Well, of course, Mexicans weren't consulted on this too much, but he felt like he needed to adapt to Mexican ways. And so what did he do? He, as an equestrian, he was very much an avid horseman. He adopted what he considered a life way or a folk way in terms of Mexican dress. However, he brought a European look to tailored clothing that we today recognize as the look of the charro, and we see this a lot in mariachi bands, when in fact it's actually again that coalescing of two different costume dress from what was called the Chinaco, who was a leather-wearing rebel out in the western part of the Mexican coalition, and bringing that more tailored look with buttons running down the trouser leg, for example, and highly embroidered short jackets. This is what Emperor Maximilian adopted as the way to connect with the people. Ironically, when he is executed 5 years later, and I find this fascinating as an art historian to look at the allegories that are here, and some clearer than others, is at his execution, he's of course still wearing his sombrero, but who are the executioners but none other than someone in leather clothing who looks very much like a charro in this great painting by Edward Manet, and who is the person to whom he surrenders in his last moments in another great French painting, but a Mexican charro in leather costume, but his sombrero is here hanging on the wall. So he maintains that, and then ultimately is executed in 1867. So all these things are happening in this creation of this idea of what we have of what a cowboy is. So all of a sudden we've gone from vaquero to chinaco to charro are all part of this equation. So what we best know about cowboys is the great trail drives that happened after the Civil War. Well, of course, they all start down pretty much down in South Texas, where Tejano rancheros own most of the land. And of course, there are American impresarios who've settled here by after the Civil War. So it's very much part of that. So as you can see from the map on the left, the cattle trails really originate down in South Texas and then go north up into Kansas. And then with the Western Trail, and I would like to stop right here for just a second and point out the Western Cattle Trail here, this yellow one here, along with the trail known today as the Chisholm Trail here, are now before the U.S. Congress to be designated National Heritage Trails. And it's important that you contact your congressman and especially your senators in Texas to tell them that the proper name for this trail, though especially the one here to the left, is actually the Western Trail. And we need to make sure that everyone understands that that was its proper name given the documentation we have today, maps from the General Land Office as well as the Department of the Interior. So Western Trail. So I urge you all to call Senator Cornine's office and tell him that you're behind this bill, because it's a great part of heritage tourism in the great state of Texas. So keep that in mind. But who were the people on those cattle drives? We've all come to believe that they were all a bunch of white cowboys, when in fact that's not true. There were Tejanos who went along, often part of the cowboy crew. Generally, 1 in 5 was a cowboy of color, either one who was Hispanic or one who was African American. And generally that's because in South Texas, most of the cowboys, vaqueros, were Hispanic. And along the Gulf Coast here in Texas, the Gulf Coast, virtually every cowboy was black. And so as we go north, those droving crews were mixed together as they got closer to what's now the state of Oklahoma, or what was then Indian Territory. Native American cowboys joined it. So they're very much part of this. But it's important to understand that these trail drives were not really as people saw them in popular culture, like in Harper's New Monthly Magazine in March 1874. They weren't cattle superhighways, and they weren't Guernseys or Jersey cows. They were very docile, and it only needed a couple of hands. There are about 4 cowboys, 4 drovers running this entire herd, and it must be 6,000 or 8,000 cows by my best guesstimate, when an average trail herd was 1,500 to 2,500. So what did the cows really look like? They were actually captured by one artist who was a contemporary of Remington and Russell, and that's Frank Ray, who I like to call the third R of Western art. And he made this great painting called The Approaching Herd in 1902, which helps us better understand what these animals really looked like. And they were hybrids of what was released on the Mexican coast in 1521. So they didn't look as neat as these milk cows you see going up the trail in the Harper's illustration. So these vaqueros who were part of this conversation were also doing the same sorts of things, not only in the Texas trail drives, but also managing herds out in California and also in Nuevo Mexico. And their primary tool was the rope. And we're going to get back to that in just a minute. But they were quite colorful, as you can see, in their dress and also in their ways. So this is a better illustration, a little bit earlier in Harper's Weekly, that shows a drove of Texas cattle crossing a river. And you'll notice that the drovers are wearing sombreros and are probably Tejanos, more than likely. And they're using whips because along the trail it was to keep the animals moving or bedded down, as you can see here. And only Frank Ray was one of the only artists who really witnessed this happening, and eventually resulting in a performance piece called 24 Hours with the Herd. Other artists caught on to this, like W. Herbert Dunton, and this whole vaquero fascination carried through into the early part of the 20th century. Great W. Herbert Dunton painting painted on the Babacora Ranch in Chihuahua, showing 2 vaqueros roping grizzlies. Charlie Russell once said, using a painting, loops and swift horses are surer than lead, because you'll notice neither of these vaqueros is armed. And the best way to kill an apex predator like a grizzly bear was to rope it and drag it to death, because you shoot it, you're just going to make it mad. And so, as you can see, these vaqueros, the greatest ropers the world has ever seen, and even still, nobody can rope like a vaquero from Mexico or from South Texas. It's just, or Southern California. It's just the way it is. So artists were fascinated by this, by the different regional variations, like this one by Edward Boreen, a contemporary and friend of Charlie Russell, who depicted this Sinaloan cowboy wearing these giant, what look like chaps, but they're in fact armas or armitas, which cover the horse and also the entire leg of the cowboy. And these are, of course, their direct ancestor of the chaparrera that eventually is attached to the leg. Our great friend, passed too soon, Bill Whitliff, did a great series on Mexican vaqueros in northern Texas ranches, and we're fortunate that his photographs tell us that technology did come forward, even in that tough country that very few cowboys can accommodate in. And so circling back to what I said before and going out to California briefly, California vaqueros, as you can see, quite colorful costumes made of leather, short jackets, oftentimes a flat brimmed hat rather than the conical shape that we're used to seeing. Their whole job was based on their skill with the rope. And so I posed the question, as you can see, putting a holstered 6-shooter next to it. What's the reason for a gun with cow work? And this is one of the most frustrating things for me as a historian, is that firearms really had no place. You might as well carry a claw hammer on the back of a horse. It's just as useful for doing this type of work as a 6-shooter. And I think this Far Side cartoon tells it better than anything. Most of the 6-shooters carried by cowboys were more likely to used to be put in staples in a roof, like we learned from Gene Ackman in Unforgiven, or to put in fence steeples, because I've seen more twisted barrels from 6-shooters that were used as a hammer rather than fired in some sort of fight in Dodge City. So this fascination with the Mexican vaquero and eventually his cousin, the Chato, finds its way into performance in U.S. Wild West shows, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. So Vicente Oropeza, the man here in the middle, becomes a superstar, an international superstar, because of his skill with the rope. And everyone begins to recognize that these are unparalleled horseback riders, as well as skilled people with a rope. Nobody can come close. And Buffalo Bill, Pawnee Bill, the 101 Ranch, all these Wild West shows took advantage of the fascination, the exoticism of the Mexican vaquero and the charro. Jose Barrera, also known as Mexican Joe, even had ballads written about him and his skill with the rope. And I also put in here the fact that exoticism was a way to sell tickets to Pawnee Bills. Exotic Mexican senoritas who could do things on the back of a horse that no one else could do. And this, of course, reminds us that women were very much part of these early Wild West shows, and even part of early rodeo. Women rode all the rough stock men did. They competed in all the timed events that men did, up until World War II, when rodeo performers eventually drove them out of rodeo because of baseless fears that they couldn't handle the rigors of rodeo. And finally, women are making their way back into rodeo today. And we have a great museum down in Fort Worth, the National Cowgirl Museum, that talks about that. Of course, there were African-American cowboys who starred in Wild West shows as well as early rodeo, including none other than Bill Pickett, who takes that vaquero tradition and uses it as a showman. He's the man who's supposed to have invented bulldogging, although his bulldogging steer wrestling technique didn't involve twisting the horns. It involved biting the lower lip or biting the snout or the nose of the steer and distracting it long enough where he could twist it to the ground. He, of course, eventually went on to work at the 101 Ranch Wild West show, as well as early in rodeo. American Indian cowboys, I mentioned earlier, tended to be in pockets in Indian Territory, as well as on the Northern Plains in the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Montana. And people like Quanah Parker even had their own herds of cattle in Western Oklahoma. And this is actually a photograph of Quanah Parker's cattle in Western Oklahoma. And Mr. Ray actually knew Quanah Parker, and his photographs need to be studied even further as part of our lexicon and understanding art of the American West. So cowboys came from all over the place. They came from the British Isles. They came from Northern Europe, Danish cowboys, German cowboys. They came from everywhere. Most of them fascinated in thinking they could do this kind of work. Women cowboys, and I put that word on there very specifically, because the word cowgirl is an invention of the Wild West show. It was a way to sell tickets. And so women who worked on ranches, and even today, will tell you that they're cowboys. And you'll notice this photograph of this woman on the left. She's actually riding side saddle on a stock saddle. She's got her leg hooked up over the horn, and yet you can see she's still adept with a rope. And the side saddle you see here in this photograph, and both these objects come from Panhandle Plains collection. This one actually was tied fast to a rope, because those are rope burns on that horn. So this was a woman who was, these women often had to do this kind of work, this kind of cow work, side saddle, which is one of the most dangerous things you could do. So this fascination with the vaquero, this fascination with the cowboy made everybody want to be that. You know, we all grew up dreaming of being a cowboy. And so dressing the part when you got your photograph made was a key thing. And notice this African-American man, if you look very closely at the photograph, he's wearing street shoes. He's put his leather cuffs on his bare arms, which no cowboy would ever do. He doesn't seem terribly familiar with the firearm, and the neck rag he's tied on. All of these things are more than likely, including his woolly chaps, they're all studio props because everyone wanted to see it that way. And if we go a little further on those three hombres there on the left, you can see that they're pretty rough and ready. But if you look at the very closely at the inscription on the back, and I'll hone into you, notice what it says. None were cowboys, just dressed this way for the picture. Happened all the time. And so we have to be even careful of what we consider the documentary evidence of cowboys. Is it this must be a puncher who went up the trail 6 or 7 times, when in fact, in many cases, they're playing dress up. So going back here to this photograph, notice these guys are all sporting smoke wagons. They have all these giant hand cannons ready to do dirty deeds. But unfortunately, the facts kind of get in the way because Texas outlawed open carry in 1871. It made it illegal for you to carry a gun while you're on a cattle drive. So if you rode through a county and you had a 6-shooter on your hip, you're going to get arrested. So what I'm trying to tell you is most of these cowboys didn't even own a sidearm. If they owned a firearm, it was a saddle gun and kept in the saddle. When they got to the Kansas cow towns after a long couple of months on the trail, carrying a firearm in town was illegal. You had to disarm yourself. So most of the time, if there were firearms on a droving crew, they were kept in the chuck wagon and locked up very, very tightly, or they were kept in the saddlebags. And most of these, the key to understanding this is most cowboys were young men between 15 and 25 years old. They came from all walks of life. And being young and immature, they get to a Kansas cow town. You give liquor and a gun to a kid, nothing good's going to happen. And so those Kansas cow towns, they knew what they were doing. So, you know, they're, you know, okay, boys, that'll be enough. We won't allow any gunplay in this town. So, you know, Gary Larson nails it because it's how ridiculous this exaggeration over gunplay has taken over popular culture, mainly through fiction and mainly through movies. So just real quickly, cowboys were young men, often little boys, and they could handle a firearm about as well as this young man in this still shot from John Wayne's famous movie, The Cowboys. And if you remember that movie, all of them show up with firearms because they think they were supposed to. Now, there were vaqueros all across the American West. Elmer Kelton fictionalized one of the great events in cowboydom, let's call it, with the Cowboy Strike of 1883 in a great book called The Day the Cowboys Quit. And it took place in the Texas Panhandle. And amongst the strikers who signed the ultimatum, the original of which is at Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, you'll notice Juan Gomez. So there were vaqueros, and in this case, they probably didn't come out of Mexico proper. They probably came from northern New Mexico and came east rather than coming from the south. And so we often see in the Texas Panhandle and in northern New Mexico, southwestern Kansas, southeastern Colorado, a lot of people coming out of, a lot of these vaqueros come out of northern New Mexico. One of the ranches that was part of the strike was the T-Anchor, just north of Canyon, Texas today. It was unique in that it had an entire Mexican crew amongst several crews. Don't get me wrong, there were multiple crews, and had a Mexican foreman named Mexican John, and they operated entirely in Spanish. This was quite unusual, but yet it is part of what we know about the T-Anchor. There were, of course, vaqueros who worked all across these ranches, but this is relatively unique and bears repeating. The big fight at Tascosa, Texas, west of Amarillo in 1884 involved some of the strikers and also some vaqueros who came out of northern New Mexico. And this was one of the few times when we do see violence in one of these towns. And Tascosa had a very bad reputation for shootouts because law was largely not present. Boot Hill Cemetery is still there on Boys Ranch. You can visit it even today. And there's even an index to go out and see who's buried in some of those graves, including Basilio Sanchez, who was killed by a horse, yet another vaquero. The idea is to show you that the vaqueros were still everywhere. So when we did the exhibition, we wanted to make sure we tried to make that distinction between a gentleman on horseback, someone who owned the cattle, was a hacendado, who owned the ranch, and the vaquero, who was a worker. And we used material culture objects to tell that. We also did it bilingually, one of the first times we've done that here at the National Cowboy Museum, and it set the stage for what would happen for us down the road. So we're very fortunate in that we found a scholar who was willing to help us with this. And we used strategic quotations from scholars like Jose Cisneros to help us better understand the difference between a caballero and a vaquero, because the vaquero is all about the work, and the caballero is, not to put too fine a point on it, looking real good on the back of a horse. So this is a couple installation shots I thought you might like to see, and we used a Joe DeYoung drawing as the cipher imaging, and you can see that images are lined up. But this is probably my favorite comparison in the exhibition between the Caballero saddle, a Charo saddle there on the left, and a Vaquero saddle, because it's still, I mean, the saddle tree is a carved wooden saddle tree. There's nothing on it. There's not even rawhide on it. And it's been so cowboy used or Vaquero used that that saddle horn is so burned up, it's almost sawn through from so many dallies and so many tying fasts that it's literally almost just held together by a few rawhide thongs. Now, my great interest is the Anonymous Vaquero, the anonymous cowboy, that we really don't know their name, and they're the ones that did all this kind of work, and we really reinforced that in the exhibition. And in the conclusion, we talked about the Caballero, and with a juxtaposition of photographs by Bill Whitliff. So hanging on the walls, as you can see in this shot, are all examples, 14 examples of Bill Whitliff's work that he donated to the National Cowboy Museum just a few months before he was taken from us. Bill did a whole portfolio in the late 1970s on the Vaquero, and as I'm understanding it, and it may be out now, it was going to be republished, and he was working on that right before he passed. But you can see in this photograph, this Charo saddle here and another Charo saddle there. And it was just a way to put that, ram that point home, or put that point right out there, that difference between the worker who does the work and who rides and looks pretty. So just reinforcing it yet again with y'all, that it is a technology that moved north, and it also moved south with regional variations. But the very beginnings, of course, are with that Vaquero, and it begins with these figures here that we saw at the very beginning. Men wearing leather on the back of a horse, and in fact, this Vaquero is actually on a mule. That's a mule. You can see by his ears. On the back of a horse, using a rope to do this work. And it's a combination of those two technologies from North and West Africa. And that's the key to that. Remember, it's a coalescing of all different kinds of things, coalescing of traditions, coalescing of clothing styles, coalescing of technologies, even foodways. You know, we've gotten used to eating things that we consider Tex-Mex, when in fact much of this was used as trail food. A fajita is actually a flank steak, of course, and it's just the strips that were left over, the scraps that were left over, and rolled in a tortilla to make breakfast or make lunch. Other artists like Frederick Remington, we mentioned before, were fascinated by Mexican cowboys, and Remington tended to refer to them all as vaqueros. And this is a wood engraving we used in the exhibition because I think it's so telling. And he did do some paintings that we do know are still in public collections around, but the wood engraving says so much because he got a quotation from an old timer that talked about the Mexican vaquero and how really amazing they were with ropes and how colorful they were, and they were all about the work. I showed you this Buck Dunton painting a little earlier because we were able to acquire this painting for the National Cowboy Museum. We had a very definitive goal in mind, and it had been on the same South Texas ranch for the last 100 years before we acquired it. And it allowed us to populate our art galleries with material culture objects, literally trying to reconstruct this painting and the vaquero gear that these vaqueros are using a saddle, a rawhide riata, a horsehair headstall, and a jaquima, same kind of piloncillo hat called a sugarloaf hat, chapareras, as you can see here, and even the espuelas are charo type or vaquero type. So we were able to literally pull the the painting off the wall using objects that we set right next to it. And these are currently in the gallery. We've also gone forward in using that whole aesthetic of what a caballero or a vaquero is in our new acquisitions, such as this great Luis Tapia sculpture, one of the leading sculptors in New Mexico, La Princesa del Rodeo, which I think pokes a little fun at that whole obsession with cowboys, especially since the rider here is the princess of the rodeo, not the prince of the rodeo. It's a great piece. We've also started to acquire more Hispanic related objects for our Western Performers collection. And we acquired Cesar Romero's Cisco Kid Charo suit that he wore in one of his several roles as the Cisco Kid. And this is currently at the Conservators and will go on exhibit very soon. We are also in the midst of planning for an exhibition called Viva Mexico to celebrate the Bicentennial of Mexico. And our focus is on those hombres a caballo, those men on horseback who played such a critical role in Mexican history. And they wore specific kinds of clothing, including this amazing early pair of botas, when the joining of a lower leg covering with a shoe that helped create in a moccasin style, a very early vaquero boot. So that's the direct descendant of that sandal that I showed you earlier. And so I'm going to leave you with a couple of questions. Given everything I've laid on you today, a great painting, one of my favorites from the Sid Richardson collection, The Sentinel. And I gave you a little hint early in the talk about what the job of this particular individual is on the back of this horse. Obviously, it's a mare with a foal. But I ask you the question, is this man a caballero or is he a vaquero or a vaquero? Is he a caballero or a vaquero? And here on one of my favorite paintings, because it talks directly about cow work, cow punching sometimes spells trouble, from 1889 by Charlie Russell. Are these vaqueros or are they caballeros? So how did we make this there? How do we make that distinction? And so even on the Northern Plains, even up in Montana, we still see that same technique learned on the shores of Eastern Mexico all the way up into Montana. So that's where I'm going to stop. It's a fascinating thing that my work on, my study on, my research on will only continue. And I want to thank a couple of people who've been so helpful to me. And one is Gene Chavez up in Kansas City and Andres Tijerina in Austin, who helped point me to sources that really helped me in my research. And so I've enjoyed visiting with you all a little bit today, and I'll be glad to take some questions if there are any. So much obliged. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. This was such a rich, powerful presentation. I know if we gave you the time, you could go into hours upon hours in more detail of each part of this. So I appreciate you taking the time to share what you have. Yeah, we have time for a couple of questions. If you'll put your questions into the Q&A box, I'll share those with Michael as I get them. One of the questions that came up, Michael, you may or may not remember some of the book titles that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation.
About Comanches?
Yeah, there was one about Comanches.
Yeah, Pekka Himalainen, and don't challenge me to spell it because I think he's Danish, but it's called Comanche Empire. Now it's about 600 pages, so you're going to have to bring a snack. So it'll take a little while, but I also mentioned Sam Gwynn's great book, Empire of the Summer Moon, a much more popular history. But if you really want to dig deep, you need to have Comanche Empire. Yeah.
And anything, we are recording this program and we'll be putting up an edited version on our YouTube channel. We'll email everyone out a link to it. So if there's anything that, any other details that Michael covered that you weren't able to take notes of, you'll be able to watch the recording later and get all of that. One of the questions that I had was, this presentation is really kind of bringing to light just how multicultural the cowboy culture was, particularly on the cattle drive. In your research, did you discover anything about what those interactions were like between, say, the vaqueros versus the Black cowboys versus, I'm not sure how closely they were working together.
Well, first I need to say that there were all Tejano crews that did go north to Kansas on occasion. Not very often. So generally there would be a Tejano Vaquero or a Mexican Vaquero that would go along, one or two, on a droving crew. And we need to understand the difference between a ranch cowboy and a drover. A drover's job is to take the herd to market, and a ranch cowboy works on the ranch. And so that mix oftentimes was skewed one way or the other. So on the droving crews, 1 in 5 was a cowboy of color generally. And so, you know, if you could do the work, it boiled down to this: amongst the hands, amongst the men, if you could do the work, they didn't care what color you were. It didn't matter. If you could do the work and you didn't leave somebody else shorthanded, and because this is incredibly dangerous work. If you're not doing your job, somebody's going to get hurt. And most importantly, the product's going to get hurt. And that's what you're doing, is you're responsible for somebody else's product, somebody else's investment. And they took a lot of pride in that. So it didn't matter what race or culture you were, as long as you got the job done. Now, in the hierarchy of management, there began to be some, there certainly was some discrimination based on beliefs, racist beliefs to a certain extent. So generally, the standard wage for an American cowboy between 1880 and 1930 was roughly $1 a day. A black cowboy got 75 cents a day. An Hispanic cowboy got 50 cents. That's a rough breakdown, gross oversimplification, but it was usually like that. Generally, foreman jobs were almost always a white cowboy. When they got to the Kansas cow towns, there was a great deal of distrust. However, black cowboys were more welcome than Hispanic cowboys, because Hispanic cowboys were seen as foreigners and therefore not to be trusted. So, and it sounds awful to say that today, but it is part of the equation. So generally, when they went into town proper to deliver the herds, the black cowboys and the Hispanic cowboys stayed in camp. Okay. Not always, but most of the time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you. So there's a question in the Q&A. Dos Rios, you say horseshoes ? I'm not sure what you're referring to, so I'll give you a second to explain a little more what your question is on horseshoes. But someone else was asking, are you familiar with the contributions of the Vaqueros from the state of Chihuahua to the first ranches in Presidio County?
Absolutely. You bet. Yeah, you can't escape it from Coahuila or Chihuahua or Sonora, Sinaloa. That all comes north, all of it. And there are no cowboys in the United States without coming out of Mexico. Everything comes out of Mexico.
Okay. And then, we have a question. You had mentioned about the Chisholm Trail and the Western Trail, and there was a question about what is the significance of the Chisholm Trail and Western Trail being designated. Just kind of get more information for if they want to reach out to Senator Cornyn.
Well, the Chisholm, it's called the Chisholm Trail. I'll talk about it in two parts. It's called the Chisholm Trail today. When you're in Texas, it was called the Kansas Trail. When you got to Indian Territory, part of it was actually a trail that's associated with a biracial man named Jesse Chisholm. As you got into Kansas, it became the Texas Trail. But the whole system is popularly known as the Chisholm Trail. The trail to the west, and they move the trails constantly west to stay ahead of the Kansas quarantine lines because of the fear of Texas fever. So the Western Trail, which forks off and goes west through Fort Griffin, crosses at Vernon, and actually goes west of Dodge City. While the Chisholm Trail was a beef supply trail to satisfy demand for beef in the Midwest, the Eastern United States, and Europe, the Western Trail is more to establish ranches on the Northern Plains. So most of the cattle that went up the Western Trail didn't get on trains in Dodge. They went around it and went on up the trail through Western Kansas, Colorado, all the way up to Western Canada. But the bottom line is those two cattle trails built America. America was built on beef. It wasn't built on broccoli. With all due respect to broccoli, I like broccoli, and I like bread too. So America was built on beef and bread, on cowboys in Kansas, Nebraska, and other wheat farmers. That's what it was built on.
Thank you. Okay, it looks like there's a comment here. I recall somewhere that a cowpoke's carrying a sidearm had more to do with his terror of rabid skunks and his pretensions as a pistolero. Are you familiar with this? Said maybe Edwin Tunis, Frontier Living.
Oh yeah, well, they almost always had a saddle gun. That's true. And that was for things like a rabid skunk, rabid coyote, whatever it was. You know, Gene and Roy could shoot the eye out of a rattlesnake from 6,000 yards. Of course they could, you know, but a rifle or a shotgun for close work is a lot more useful in those contexts. Six shooters are notoriously inaccurate. And they also had a tendency, the early ones, especially if they were cap and ball or conversions, they do something called chain fire and they blow up in your hand. So cowboys, after the association through fiction, the association of cowboys with firearms became so prominent, cowboys started to believe their own myth. So they thought they should carry a gun. And I've even found quotes that talk about that. We didn't think we was a man until we could carry a 6-shooter and roll a Bull Durham cigarette at a trot. So they thought they were supposed to, you know. And Gene and Roy, remember this, Gene and Roy in the movies, the so-called B westerns, they almost never fired their guns. They wore them, but most of the time they solved their problems with their wits or their fists.
Interesting.
And that's been, thanks to Quentin Tarantino, everything's bloodbath now, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're out of time here, but I want to thank Michael, first of all, for putting together such a fantastic presentation. And as I mentioned to everyone, we are recording this, so everyone who's attending tonight will receive an email of the link to this presentation later on when it's available on our YouTube channel, if you want to review anything that Michael has shared, because it is packed full of so much information, and if you would want to share it with others as well. So I hope that those of you who are watching at home that you learned a little bit more about this multi-faceted cross-cultural history of this part of our culture, of cowboy culture. I know I've learned a lot in just an hour here, so I hope you have too, and I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight for our program. And I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Come see us at the National Cowboy Museum.
Absolutely.